three-legged stool is a great project because it involves both spindle turning and face grain turning. It's a little bit challenging at first thinking about all the parts and reproducing multiples that look alike for all the legs. But the important thing, like with most projects, is to break it down into each segment. And that's what we'll do along the way. I'll start with making the seat. I've got a block of cherry that I've already cut out on the bandsaw. It's 14 inches in diameter, 2 inches thick. And this is still rough sawn, pretty rough. Actually works quite well for this because the rough sawn material is a little bit thicker. It hasn't been pre-planed. I'll flatten it on the lathe. So this way I get a little bit thicker blank. I've drilled a hole in the center of it to mount it on my screw chuck. And I've made sure that that hole is only 1/2 inch deep. Now, because my screw chuck protrudes further than 1/2 inch, I'm going to use a plywood spacer over that screw so that I only have 1/2 inch of screw exposed. As long as I tighten the blank securely up against this plywood disc, securely up against the face of the jaws, everything will hold well. The first thing I'll do is use a 3/8 inch bowl gouge to flatten the face of this blank. Primarily I'll just use a scraping cut, just letting the wing scrape away the waste, at least until I get it flat. Here I'm using a bevel rubbing cut, and I can experiment as to which leaves the nicest cut. But when the blank is not true, that bevel rubbing cut tends to give more bouncing, like so. So oftentimes I'll use a scraping cut here. Again, just looking to flatten the blank. Not as concerned at this point about torn grain. Almost completely around. With a straight edge, I'll double check my progress here. Fairly flat. Now I'll true up the rim. True up the circumference, I definitely want to rub the bevel. I want to get down below the unevenness. I want the bevel to rub up against the wood that I've just cut, while the wing, in this case I'm cutting to the left, so the left-hand wing will be ripping away the waste, while the bevel on the end rubs up against the wood that I just cut. And this provides a very smooth cut. I can get an improved cut by going to a bowl gouge that has a 45-degree bevel. This one happens to be square ground. For this cut, it doesn't matter if it's square or fingernail ground. As long as the bevel is rubbing, I'm just utilizing that 45-degree bevel to get a slightly cleaner cut. So with the face flat, the circumference true, I'll lay out some lines here for a round over on this edge. I'm going to use 3/4 of an inch from the edge around the circumference. a 1/2 inch from the edge on the bottom face. And now I can utilize the bowl gouge to round over between these lines. I'll make this with a bevel rubbing cut up against the surface I just cut. And I'm cutting outwards because of the grain direction. I'll just continue this round over from pencil line to pencil line, rubbing the bevel. And for a finishing cut, I was getting just a little bit nicer shaving, a little bit smoother finish from this 45-degree bevel. So I am going to switch back to that just for the last pass. There's a minute difference, but since I have it available, just rubbing the bevel, swinging the handle around the corner. So with this bottom round over shaped, I'm going to lay out the leg holes. First I want to mark the center. Now I've adjusted my compass to 5 inches so it'll create a 10-inch circle. I'm just going to place that right on that center. Laying on the tool rest, I can go ahead and mark a 10-inch circle. Now I'll choose any spot along this circle. I'm going to place the leg right here. Just make a small indentation. I haven't adjusted the compass. I'm going to make a mark. Then I'm going to move the leg of the compass to that intersection. Make another mark. I'll continue this around. It'll give me 6 equally spaced intersections. And if we double check back to the original, getting nearly the same mark, and that's certainly close enough for a 3-legged stool. With 6 locations marked, I'm going to mark every other location with a punch. And that gives me 3 hole locations for the legs. Now I'm going to mark a recess on the bottom for my chuck. I need about a 2-inch recess. To make the recess, I'll use a square nose scraper. I'll cut right on center line at the center. looking for a depth of about 1/4 of an inch. And then from the center, I'll raise the tool rest slightly so that I cut up above center. Simply pushing straight in. Might be just a little bit too high. Now the chuck that I'm using is a one-way talon. It has straight jaws, so I'll make my recess straight. If you have dovetail-shaped jaws on your chuck, you may choose to make that dovetail. Bottom's just a little rough, so I can make a light cut. Real light across the bottom and smooth that up. Now I'll go ahead and sand the bottom. So to sand the bottom, I use power sanding, just a disc sander, running the opposite direction of the lathe. Makes real quick work. I won't sand the recess though, I'll hand sand that later. I don't want to damage the perfect straight sides that fit the chuck. Now it's easy to mount the bowl or mount the seat holding it with one hand, operating the key with the other. But it's also easy to get it a little bit crooked. It's kind of hard to balance. Or if your chuck doesn't have a key and you use lever bars, it's actually easier to remove the chuck, place the chuck in the recess, and with firm pressure down, expand the jaws into the recess. You generally get a better fit by doing that, and then mounting the entire chuck and blank on the lathe. And that's running nice and true. I always double check a couple times to make sure I did snug up the jaws correctly. It's running nice and true. Now I just need to flatten the face. I can experiment with a bevel rubbing cut or a scraping cut. Whichever yields the best results. And I flattened it off. It is nice and straight with the ruler, that's good. Now I want to make a round over on this edge. I'm going to go 1 1/8 from the outside edge. And then use where I stopped over here on the bottom as my other line. And just as before, I'll use the bowl gouge, rubbing the bevel to round over between the pencil lines. And I am intentionally working from the center out. Because of the grain direction, this is cross grain. And so this is the downhill direction in terms of grain. With each pass, getting closer and closer to my lines, just trying to approximate the correct curve, and making adjustments to swinging the handle as needed. And then to hollow the seat, it's just like hollowing a very shallow bowl. I'm going to rub the bevel the entire time, working towards the center with each cut. Then going back a little further, working towards the center. The bevel in the end rubs up against the surface that I just cut. I'm cutting to the right, so the wing on the right is ripping away the waste. I swing the handle to create a curve, but I don't swing the handle very much because there's very little curve. And I'm using my pencil line and the drilled hole as my starting and stopping points. And remembering to slow down as I get towards the center. And there I just reached the bottom of my hole, so I really don't want to go any deeper, but I haven't quite made it to my pencil line yet. So I'll just adjust my curve so that I'm removing more material out here. And tapering off and not removing material in the center. This may be my last pass. It's actually a pretty good curve. That feels pretty good, ready for sanding. All right, I've put a small brad point bit into the drill press that I can line up with my hole. So I'm just using the tip of a brad point bit to line that up, make sure it's still on my center line. And clamp the jig fully in place. So I'll bring the bit down just until it touches the wood. Then adjust my depth stop to 1.25 inches. And drill a hole at this location. And repeat for the other two holes. So I've got a leg blank here. I've got a hole location for the rung, marked 6.5 inches from the bottom, in the center of one face here. Just using a small brad point bit to get this lined up. I've got a fence across the back, parallel to the back edge of the jig. Perfect. Now I'll install 3/4 inch Forstner bit. And I'll bring the bit down just until it touches the wood. And adjust my depth stop to 1 inch. With the fence and the stop in place, I can drill the other two holes in exactly the same location. So with the seat complete and the hole in the leg drilled for the rung, turn our attention to turning the leg. We're going to use drive centers that are small. They've got to be less than 3/4 of an inch because I'm going to have small diameters at the end, and I want to be able to turn all the way up against my center. So this is a 9/16 stub center. This is a one-way live center. It has about a 9/16 or half an inch, a little bit over that end on it as well. So I've got those mounted in the headstock and tailstock. I'm going to mount my blank between centers. I've got that marked already on the end of the blank. I'm going to place the rung hole towards the headstock end. Capture the blank between centers here and adjust my tool rest. I use a spindle roughing gouge to turn this blank into a cylinder. Now, oftentimes on spindles, I touch the back side. I do this for two reasons. Number one, I'm able to feel the shape. Here I can actually feel that it's not smooth yet, so it still has corners on it. I can also support as it gets thinner. I can put a little pressure against the wood that's flexing to counterbalance the pressure that I'm putting forward with the tool. Oftentimes I do this all in one motion. Again, to support and to feel what I'm doing. And I am making note that there is a hole right here, so when my fingers go across there, it's not going to feel smooth. But if it's smooth on both sides, I know that it is a cylinder. And doing that really helps you to maintain a full size spindle, so I didn't lose any size on this. It's still a full 2 inches. Now to turn the leg, like the rest of the project, I want to break this down into manageable sections, each individual component within the leg. And this is going to help me not only create this one leg, but replicate it over and over so that all three legs are the same. So to do that, I'm going to establish reference lines of where it transitions from one shape to another. And to keep that consistent between them, rather than measuring each one, I'm going to use a story stick. The story stick has all the locations already marked. I've cut the notch with a bandsaw. I can simply place a pencil in here and mark each line. The story stick is also useful. I mark locations on here, different diameters, different reference points for me. Just things that I need to remember. I made a note that at the very end it's going to be 1 inch in diameter. Even though my story stick doesn't go all the way to the end, there's no need for that. I made a note of the size of my blank, where the rung hole needs to be and what size that is. And again, the critical diameters at some of these various points. For simplicity's sake, I didn't mark some of the other locations diameter because that's going to be the full 2-inch diameter. I won't need to change from where it is now. From the first reference line towards the tailstock, I need to make a tenon that will fit tightly into the stool. That was a 1-inch hole, so I need to create a 1-inch diameter tenon. So I've set a pair of calipers just over 1 inch so that I can sneak up on it and get a good tight fit. I'm going to use a parting tool right on the line. And part down until the calipers stop. Now I can stop the lathe and check this as I go, but just like my fingers on the back side, if I round the corners of the calipers ever so slightly so they're not sharp, I can use these while it's rotating, placed against the back of this piece. Tighten up the tailstock just a little bit. A little excess vibration. Let's try that again. Place the calipers right on the back side. That's better. And just hold them against there until they slip over. Right there. Now because this tenon is a little longer, I'm going to make another cut here. They just fit. And now I can part away the waste. Smooth up that cylinder. Before testing the fit in the bottom of the seat, I'll take the skew chisel, make a slight chamfer right on the end, just to ease it into the hole. Now I'll remove the leg from the lathe, test the fit into the bottom of the seat. So after test fitting that, you can see a sheen actually on here where it begins to get tight going into the hole. I can use that to my advantage to tell me just a little bit that needs to come off. Key is to take your time here so you get a good fit. Now that the tenon fits well, I'll start moving to the left, creating profiles from one line to the next, always working downhill in terms of grain. So my next logical transition is going to be right here at this third line. It's actually where two partial beads come together, so I'm going to make a V groove with the skew. Looking for a V groove that's about 3/16 of an inch wide, about 3/16 of an inch deep. And just by eye, I don't have to measure that. Now I'll make a partial round over. So I'll work from this pencil line to the bottom of the V groove. Move the tool rest up just slightly, make it a little more comfortable for me. So I'm just going to roll the skew. Just making half of a bead. Rolling from the pencil line down to the bottom of the V groove. And I could switch to the spindle detail gouge to make this as well. I do want to leave my pencil line for reference. That side looks good. Now I want to create a little bit of a round over here, again from the pencil line to the bottom of the V groove. This is a very small round over. And sometimes when two details come together, you do have to work back and forth, get them to mate perfectly. You get a little bit of that vibration there sometimes. It's different grains because it is a longer spindle. Flexes just ever so slightly in the middle. By putting my fingers behind it there, I support it and get rid of that vibration. Now I want to create an ogee, which is part of a bead and part of a cove from this line to the tenon. And I do want to go ahead and mark, I forgot earlier, but want to mark the end of that tenon so I know not to cut beyond that. That fits perfectly. Oftentimes, details on a spindle are done with a spindle detail gouge. But if it's a broad shape, I find the spindle roughing gouge a little more appropriate. I start by making part of a cove. And then transition part of a bead into that. And eventually marrying the two together. Don't want to get rid of my pencil line, don't want to turn past that. Now, if this is my first leg, Just looking to create a pleasing OG shape. OGs don't have a clearly defined stopping point of the bead and starting point of the cove, so feel free to use your imagination and produce what looks best to you. And I'm getting a little bit of that vibration there again. I'll use my fingers behind. My thumb puts pressure on the top of the tool down to the tool rest. Now that's pretty close. Again, if this is my first spindle, I do a shape that looks nice. If I've already made one that looks nice and I want to replicate that, I'll use a profile gauge. So I've already produced one leg before. I copied this profile, pressed the profile into this profile gauge, and now if I compare it to the one that I'm producing now, I can see that it's very close, but wherever the gauge is touching, that's where I need to remove material. Don't need to remove any material here or here, a little bit right in this area. When I make a cut, I'll just feather out into nothing. Stop and check my progress with the profile gauge again. And that's getting very close. Probably close enough. I might make just one more small cut right in here. But for 3 legs that'll be a couple inches apart, that's close enough. The next line here is where I need to make a parting cut down to 1 1/4 inches. I'm just going to center my parting tool on that line. And this is just a reference for the bottom of a cove. Again with the calipers on the back side, just until they slip through. Then I'm going to reduce this diameter here to 1 3/4 inches. And check that with the calipers. Almost. Perfect. Now it's going to be hard to gauge this cove here without some of the other shapes first. So here's a point where I'm going to break the rule of always working from the tailstock to the headstock, simply because it's a lot easier to see the shapes when part of them are already defined. So I move down to these lines. It's going to be a couple of beads that come together. So I use the tip of the skew chisel to create a V groove at each transition. And like the V groove before, I'm looking for about 3/16 of an inch wide, about 3/16 of an inch deep. I'll go ahead and make one over here. It's a mirror image on this side. Those two look even. Now I can create a half of a bead from this line to the bottom of the V. Just as before, I could use a spindle detail gouge, but I'm comfortable with the skew, and it'll leave a nice finish. Here in the middle of the spindle, I get a little more flexing. Keeping my fingers on the back side helps to eliminate that. Now that I've got this side shaped half of a bead, it's a lot easier to see the rest of the OG and half of a cove down here. So I'll start with the cove. It's a big, broad cove. I got plenty of room to use the rough and gouge. So that's my choice. And because it thins down right here, it does want to flex a little bit. My hand on the back side helps to get rid of that vibration. The cove, I just worked both sides, left and right, down to the bottom where I made a parting cut. That's a little reference point for me. And I just want to start my cut where that bead began up here. That side of the cove looks pretty nice. This side is the OG. If you take light cuts, it's not too bad. You might not need the support on the back side, but to get a little more aggressive, you tend to get a little bit of vibration. And even here, it's not too bad. The bottom of the cove, try to marry it together. Again, for the first leg, I just try to make a shape that looks pleasing to the eye. There's not a right or wrong OG here. Just as long as it looks nice. But after I've made my original, I use a profile gauge once again. This is just a little bit longer one, instead of making short segments of a long section. I've pressed this up against the original. And if I hold that on here, it really matches quite well. It's just a little bit maybe to remove right in this area. Real close there. So now back to working at other details. I've got part of a bead from the pencil lines to the bottom of the V. I'll make those with the tip of the skew again. Just a little bit of vibration there. And again, I may have to work back and forth at the bottom of this transition to make the two meet perfectly. Same thing on the other side. Now I'll reduce this section here to 1 3/4 inches. Perfect. So there's a cove in between these two partial beads. Since it's a short distance and I've reduced the diameter, I didn't bother making a pencil line there. I'm just going to eyeball the midpoint, make a parting cut, down to 1 1/4 inches again. Just until they pass. Now, because this is such a narrow cove, my roughing gouge is a little too wide. So I definitely am going to use my spindle detail gouge. Cut this cove from both sides. And that vibration is just because it's gotten a little thin towards the center, and it's a long distance between the 2 points. Light cuts, a little bit of pressure from my fingers behind eliminates that. It's still vibrating a little bit, sometimes changing the speed, slowing it down, or sometimes even speeding it up slightly. You can get a little harmonic action in the spindle. Just a minute change sometimes will make a difference. That cove is nice. Now there's half of a bead, again from the pencil line to the bottom of the V-cut. And with everything else complete, just need a taper towards the end. Again, I used my story stick for reference. I made a note at the end, needs to be 1 inch in diameter. It's just a reminder to myself as to what these different lines mean. No sense in making a pencil mark at the end, it's the very end of the spindle. Just going to use the parting tool. My caliper's set to 1 inch. Right on the very end. And this is why it's important to have small diameter centers so that I can work all the way up to the end. Calipers fit. Now it's just a taper from the pencil line to the parting cut. Again, the roughing gouge will make quick work of this. And a straight edge helps to keep the taper nice and even. There's a little hollow in the center, so I'll just remove from here down. Doesn't take much to remove it. And then, so when the stool scoots across the floor, to prevent the splintering on the bottom, just a small, about an 1/8 inch chamfer right on the end. All that's left is sanding the spindle. So with all 3 legs turned, I've got them installed in the seat here, turned upside down. I need to measure the distance between the rung holes for the rung. And this can vary slightly, just depending on the exact angle and exact position of everything. So the best way to do this is to position 2 holes here, roughly lined up with each other. And then I just got a couple of dowels here, rubber banded them together so they kind of stay. They form a little measuring stick. And I just place one into the bottom of one hole, one into the bottom of the other hole, and they'll hold each other there. Then I'll use a little strip of tape. I don't want this dimension to change. So I just wrap a little bit of tape around here. And that keeps those locked together. Now if I remove one of the legs, I can measure the exact length of the rung needed. So I've cut my foot rung to exact length and then drilled a hole for the T rung. That's a 3/4 inch hole at 90 degrees, just 3/4 of an inch deep. Marked the centers on both ends. Once again, I'll use the small diameter centers. And we'll get this into a cylinder first. I need to mark the tenons on each end. It's going to go into the leg. Those were 1 inch. So I'll just use a ruler here. I'll use the skew to put just a small chamfer on the end, again to help it go into the hole easily. And a slight chamfer as well. Now I'll check the fit in the leg. That's a good tight fit. That one's just barely looser. It's actually even better than the other. It's nice and tight, but it goes on perfectly. Now it's just an OG from the center towards the tenons. I'm gonna go ahead and mark where those tenons end on each end. And again, big broad shape, rough and gouge, makes quick work of it and helps to make a more fluid shape. Less bumps and undulations along the way. And as it does get thinner, you may find putting your fingers behind helps a little bit. Again, I like it because it lets me feel my progress. Can feel little bumps. I would say that OG looks pretty nice. Now I'd like to replicate that on the other side. So as I've done before, I'll use a profile gauge. I'm just going to go from the pencil line down, and it doesn't go quite to the end, but I know that that's pretty much a cylinder from there, so it should help me gauge. Now if I flip it over, that's the profile I want to produce on the opposite side. Get to the roughing gouge and make that happen. Profile gauge tells me that wherever the profile is touching is where it needs to be removed. So essentially I need to remove just a little bit from this entire profile. That will bring everything down and it'll touch on this end. And that's a mirror image. I'll sand the spindle. Then I can make the other rung. So with all the parts turned, I can do a dry fit, take everything back apart, put glue in all the holes, clamp everything together. So we've got the legs, and it is kind of a balancing act here to get everything in. Everything meets at angles. So just get it started in there a little bit. And then to get the last leg in, you pull the other legs out a little bit until it starts to drop in. Put everything in evenly, a little bit each time. You'll hear them bottom out. Make sure the rungs are in fully. And then I'd use a strap clamp. Once I got the glue in there, pull a strap clamp up around the legs. And that would hold the legs in real good. If you need to, a little weight on the seat, wait for the glue to dry.